When my daughter got married, I didn't tell her that I inherited $9 million from her grandfather. Thank God I kept my mouth shut about it, because 3 days after the wedding, my new son-in-law walked into my house with a notary sitting right behind him, papers in hand, ready for my signature. He had no idea I already knew exactly what he was after. My name is Frank Coleman. I'm 61 years old. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And until a few months ago, I was just a retired shop teacher who spent his mornings fixing up an old truck in the garage. Nobody looked twice at me at the hardware store. Nobody knew what was sitting quietly in a bank account with my name on it. And that's exactly how I wanted to keep it. Settle in, because this story is going to take you somewhere you don't expect. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. Because trust me, you don't want to miss how this one ends. My father's name was William Coleman, and for most of my life, he was more of a stranger than a dad. He built a steel supply business from nothing back in the 1970s, and by the time I was in high school, he had trucks running all over western Pennsylvania and a house on a hill that looked down over the rest of us. He wanted me to take over the business someday. I wanted to teach kids how to use a table saw and read a blueprint. He never forgave me for that. We had one bad argument about it when I was 24 years old, and after that, we just drifted. Christmas cards, a phone call twice a year, nothing more. I got married, had my daughter Emily, built a quiet, normal life on a teacher's salary, and my father built his empire 2 hours away without me in it. He never met Emily more than a handful of times. He sent a check on her birthday every year and nothing else. I used to tell myself I didn't care. That was a lie I got good at telling. Then one Tuesday morning in March, I got a call from a law office in Pittsburgh. My father had passed away in his sleep at 84 years old. Heart gave out. No warning, no pain according to the doctor. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone for a long time after the call ended. Not sure what I was supposed to feel about a man I barely knew anymore. Sadness came eventually, but so did something else. A strange, heavy curiosity about what would happen next. I didn't know yet that next Tuesday would change my entire life. The reading of the will happened 8 days later in a small office downtown with dark wood paneling and a lawyer named Gerald Davies, who had known my father for 30 years. I expected maybe some old furniture, a few boxes of tools, something small to remember him by. I did not expect Mr. Davies to slide a folder across the table and tell me that my father had left me the entire estate. The house, the remaining shares of the business he'd sold 2 years earlier, the investment accounts, all of it. Once everything settled and the taxes were handled, Mr. Davies said the number quietly, like he was handing me a live wire. Just over $9 million. I remember the room went completely silent except for a clock ticking somewhere behind me. I asked him twice to repeat it, not because I didn't hear him, but because my brain refused to accept it the first time. He told me there was a letter, too, handwritten, sealed, just for me. I didn't open it in that office. I folded it into my jacket pocket and drove home in silence, both hands on the wheel like the car might tip over if I wasn't careful. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I made a decision that would shape everything that came after it. I was not going to tell anyone, not my ex-wife, not my friends at the hardware store, and especially not Emily, who was 3 months away from her wedding day. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed time to think clearly before money changed how anyone looked at me. I had no idea yet how right that instinct would turn out to be. Emily had been dating a man named Tyler Grant for almost 2 years by the time my father passed. Tyler was 29, worked in what he called business development, which as far as I could tell meant he sold something to somebody, but never explained exactly what. He was polished, good haircut, good handshake, always complimenting my truck or my garage or whatever was nearby. The kind of charm that works great in a 5-minute conversation and starts feeling thin after an hour. Emily was head over heels, and I wanted to be happy for her. I really did try. But there was something about the way Tyler asked questions that never sat right with me. Early on, before I even knew about the inheritance, he asked me once, almost casually over a beer on my back porch, whether my father and I were close and whether I ever talked about family money. I remember laughing it off at the time, telling him my father and I barely spoke. He nodded slowly and changed the subject, but I noticed he asked it again in a different way about a month later, wrapped inside a question about Emily's college fund. When they got engaged that spring, right around the time my father's estate was still being finalized, Tyler started showing up to family dinners with little comments about setting up their future the right way and protecting what mattered. I told myself I was being paranoid, that a young man planning a wedding just naturally thinks about money and stability, but some quiet part of me had already started paying closer attention. And once you start noticing a pattern, you can't stop seeing it. Wedding planning turned into its own kind of pressure cooker that summer. Tyler wanted a venue out at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place that charges more for one Saturday evening than most people make in 2 months. Emily kept apologizing to me about the cost, telling me they'd find a way to make it work on their own. And every time she said that, something in my chest twisted a little tighter. I had $9 million sitting quietly in an account, and my daughter was doing math on a napkin trying to figure out how to afford flowers. I ended up quietly covering a good portion of the wedding costs myself, wiring money to the venue and the caterer directly, telling Emily it came from savings and a small life insurance payout from her grandfather. That part wasn't exactly a lie, just not the whole truth. Tyler, for his part, seemed very interested in exactly how the payments were being made. He asked Emily more than once who was handling the deposits and whether her dad had come into some money recently, phrasing it like a joke, but his eyes weren't joking when he said it. Emily brushed it off every time, telling him I was just a generous father who'd been saving for this day her whole life. I let her believe that story too, because it was easier than opening a door I wasn't ready to open. Looking back now, I can see clearly how careful Tyler was being, laying groundwork, asking questions in a way that always sounded harmless on the surface. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking a nervous groom. I was wrong about that, and I would find out exactly how wrong soon enough. The wedding day itself was, if I'm being completely honest, beautiful. Emily looked exactly like her mother did on our own wedding day 30 years earlier. And for a few hours that afternoon, I let myself just be a proud father instead of a man sitting on a secret the size of a small fortune. The vineyard looked incredible in the September light. String lights strung between the trees. Everyone dressed up and laughing. Tyler's mother, Diane, a sharp woman from Ohio with a habit of complimenting people in a way that also sounded like an insult, cornered me near the bar at one point and said out of nowhere, "It's such a relief Emily has a father who can help them get started right." I smiled and said something forgettable, but I remember the exact way she watched my face after she said it, like she was checking for a reaction. During the toast, Tyler stood up with a glass of champagne and talked about building a secure future together and making smart decisions as a family, which struck me as an odd thing to say at a wedding instead of talking about love or partnership. A few people laughed politely. Emily looked happy and a little embarrassed the way brides do when a speech gets slightly awkward. I clapped along with everyone else, but underneath the applause, I felt that same cold, quiet feeling I'd had on the back porch months earlier. Something about Tyler's focus on money, even here, even today, told me this wasn't nervous excitement. This was a man who had already been thinking hard about numbers he didn't officially know existed yet. He danced with my daughter. I hugged her tight. I told her I loved her and that I was proud of her. And every word of that was completely true. But driving home that night alone in my truck, I knew something was coming, even if I couldn't yet say exactly what. The honeymoon lasted 10 days. A trip to the Outer Banks that I quietly paid for as a wedding gift. Again, dressed up as money I'd been putting aside. When they got back, something shifted. Tyler started calling me. Not Emily, me directly, which he had never really done before. He'd ask if I wanted to grab lunch or if I needed help around the house, offering to fix a gutter or look at my truck's transmission, things he had zero background in and even less interest in before the wedding. At first, I told myself this was just a son-in-law trying to build a relationship, and I wanted to believe that because some part of me still wanted Tyler to be a good man for my daughter's sake. But the calls kept coming, always friendly, always casual, and always eventually circling toward a version of the same question. How was I doing financially since retirement? Did I have a good system for managing my accounts? Had I ever thought about consolidating things so they were easier to track as I got older? He said all of this with a smile in his voice, the way you'd ask someone about their garden or their golf game. But I had spent 30 years teaching teenagers, and you learn fast how to spot a kid who's buttering you up before asking for something bigger. Tyler was doing the exact same thing, just with better grammar and a wedding ring. One Sunday afternoon, he showed up unannounced with a six-pack of the beer I liked, sat on my porch for 2 hours, and steered the conversation no less than 4 times toward protecting assets for the family. I nodded along and gave him nothing. But that night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same table where I decided to keep my secret. And I admitted something to myself. My son-in-law knew. I needed to know how much Tyler actually knew and how he'd found it out. So, I called an old friend of mine, Sam Whitfield, who I'd taught alongside for 20 years before he left the classroom to do private investigation work on the side, mostly background checks for small businesses. I told Sam the whole situation over coffee, laid it out plainly. My father, the will, the $9 million, Tyler's strange questions creeping in earlier and earlier. Sam didn't look surprised. He told me probate records are public in Pennsylvania, meaning anyone with a little patience and an internet connection can search county court websites and find out exactly what an estate was worth and who inherited it. It took him 15 minutes at his own kitchen table to pull up my father's filing and confirm the number himself, just to show me how easy it was. Then he asked me something that made my stomach drop. He asked when Tyler had proposed to Emily. I told him, and Sam pulled up the date my father's estate had been filed with the county, cross-referenced against local obituary listings. My father died in March. The filing became public record in early April. Tyler proposed to Emily the second week of April. Sam looked at me across that coffee shop table and said quietly, "Frank, I think you need to ask yourself if this was ever really about your daughter." I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it could be a coincidence that plenty of young men proposed in springtime, that I was building a conspiracy out of timing and a few too many questions on a porch. But some part of me, the part that had spent months noticing every small thing, already knew Sam was right. And I needed real proof before I said a single word to anyone. Sam offered to dig deeper, and I said yes before I even finished thinking it through, because at that point, I needed to know the truth more than I needed to protect my own comfort. It took him about 2 weeks. What he found wasn't just uncomfortable. It was almost textbook. Tyler had been engaged once before, 4 years earlier, to a woman named Patricia, whose family owned a chain of dry cleaning stores across 3 counties. That engagement had ended 8 months in, right around the time Patricia's father sold the business, and the money didn't flow the way Tyler apparently expected it to. There was no lawsuit, no public drama, just a quiet breakup that Patricia's old college roommate tracked down through a mutual contact, described to Sam as him losing interest the second the money situation changed. Sam also found a pattern in Tyler's job history. 3 different sales positions in 5 years, each one ending not long after he'd built relationships with wealthier clients and then apparently tried to insert himself into their personal financial decisions. Once even getting an older client to add him as an authorized user on a business account before getting fired for it. None of it was criminal exactly. Nothing that would hold up cleanly in a courtroom. But all of it painted the same picture over and over. A man who found financial opportunity in relationships and moved quickly once he sensed real money nearby. I sat with that file in my hands for a long time in my garage that night. The same garage where I used to feel closest to being useful. And I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with my father's money and everything to do with my daughter's future. I wasn't angry yet. I was preparing. I decided not to say anything to Emily right away because I needed to see exactly how far Tyler was willing to go, and because some small stubborn part of me hoped I was wrong. I didn't have to wait long. About 3 weeks after the honeymoon, Tyler called and said he wanted to stop by with something important, just paperwork stuff. Nothing big, he said in that same easy tone he used for everything. I told him to come Saturday morning. When Saturday came, He pulled into my driveway with a folder under his arm and a woman I didn't recognize walking beside him, a woman he introduced simply as Karen. She's a notary. Works with my company sometimes. My stomach dropped the second I saw her lanyard. Tyler sat at my kitchen table, the very same table, and slid the folder toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He explained it as a family protection plan, something his financial advisor had recommended, a document that would let him serve as a secondary authorized contact on certain accounts in case anything ever happened to me, framed entirely around love and caution in taking care of an aging father-in-law. He even brought up my father's sudden death as an example, said it so gently, like he was worried about me, like this whole thing was born out of concern. Karen, the notary, sat quietly at the end of the table with her stamp and her folder, waiting for a signature that would have handed my son-in-law legal reach into money he wasn't even supposed to know existed. I looked at that folder for a long moment, and then I looked up at Tyler and I asked him calmly if he wanted to know how I found out about Patricia. His face changed instantly, the Polish cracking right off him in real time. He asked what I was talking about, but his voice had lost that easy practice smoothness and something tighter and more nervous took its place. I told him plainly, no yelling, no dramatics, just facts laid out one after another, the way I used to explain a math problem to a slow student. I told him about the probate filing timeline, about the engagement that ended right when Patricia's family's business sold, about the job history Sam had pulled together, about the authorized user situation that got him fired. I told him I knew about his questions on my porch, his phone calls about consolidating accounts, every single breadcrumb he thought he'd scattered so carefully over the past several months. Karen, the notary, sat frozen at the end of the table, clearly realizing this was not the routine signing she'd been called in for. Tyler tried to recover, said I was misunderstanding everything, that this was purely about family security, that any reasonable person plans ahead. I let him talk for almost a full minute without interrupting because I wanted him to hear exactly how thin it sounded once it was actually being said out loud instead of dressed up in a soft, caring voice on my back porch. When he finally stopped, I slid the folder back across the table toward him, closed, unsigned, and told him I wasn't going to be signing anything that day or any day after it. Then I told him something else, something I'd been holding on to for weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment to say it out loud. I told him Emily was going to hear every single word of this from me before the end of that week. Karen, the notary, left almost immediately after that, gathering her folder and her stamp without a word, clearly wanting no part of whatever this had become. Tyler stayed a few minutes longer, alternating between anger and a kind of desperate backpedaling, telling me I was making a mistake, that I was going to destroy his marriage over assumptions that Emily would never believe any of this, coming from me because it would sound like a jealous father trying to control her life. That part actually worried me a little because he wasn't entirely wrong about how it might look on the surface. A father with a secret fortune suddenly accusing his new son-in-law right after refusing to hand over any control. So, instead of just telling Emily my version of the story, I decided to show her the actual proof. The probate timeline, Sam's research, and something I hadn't mentioned to Tyler yet. A recording. I'd started recording our conversation quietly on my phone the moment Karen, the notary, walked through my door, tucked into my shirt pocket, because some instinct told me I needed more than my word alone. I called Emily that same afternoon and asked her to come by the house without Tyler. Told her it was important. Told her I loved her, and this wasn't easy for me either. She showed up 2 hours later looking nervous, asking immediately if I was sick, if something was wrong with my health. And I told her no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told her months ago. I sat her down at that same kitchen table, made her a cup of coffee the way she'd always liked it since she was a teenager. And I told her everything, starting with my father's death and ending with the notary who had been sitting in that exact chair 3 hours earlier. Emily sat completely still while I talked, her coffee going cold in front of her, untouched. I told her about the $9 million first, watched her face go through shock, and then something close to hurt, asking quietly why I hadn't told her sooner. I explained honestly that I was scared of exactly what had ended up happening, that money changes how people look at you, and I hadn't wanted it changing how anyone looked at her wedding either. She nodded slowly, absorbing that part, and I could see she understood it even through the sting. Then I moved to Tyler, and that's when her whole posture shifted. I laid the probate timeline in front of her, showed her the dates side by side, my father's death, the public filing, his proposal 2 weeks later. I told her about Patricia, about the dry cleaning business, about the authorized user situation from his old job. I played her a short piece of the recording from that morning, just enough for her to hear his voice explaining the family protection plan to a notary he'd brought without asking me first. Emily didn't cry right away. She just sat there very quietly for almost a full minute, staring at the folder Tyler had left behind on my counter, the one I still hadn't signed. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way that surprised me. And she said, "He asked me twice last month if you'd ever mentioned changing your will." I hadn't known that detail. It confirmed everything Sam had already found, laid out fresh and painful from her own memory. She thanked me quietly for telling her. Then she asked me for the folder, the recording, and Sam's full report. And she said she needed to go home and talk to her husband herself tonight alone. I didn't hear from her for 2 days, and those were 2 of the longest days I'd had since the funeral. When she finally called, her voice sounded exhausted but clear, the voice of someone who had already made a decision and simply needed to say it out loud to make it real. She told me the conversation with Tyler had gone about as badly as I'd expected. He denied everything at first, then shifted to blaming me, calling me manipulative for hiding the inheritance in the first place, trying to twist the entire situation around so that his own behavior looked like a reasonable reaction to my secrecy. Emily told him plainly that hiding money from a daughter and secretly researching a father-in-law's net worth before proposing were not the same thing, and he didn't have a good answer for that. She also told me his mother Diane had gotten involved, calling her directly to insist that Emily was overreacting and that every family looks out for its future, which only confirmed for Emily that Diane had likely known exactly what her son was doing from the start. By the end of that conversation, Emily told Tyler she needed space, packed a bag, and drove to a friend's apartment across town instead of going back to their place that night. She told me she wasn't making any final decisions yet out of anger, that she wanted a clear head first, but that something had broken between them that she didn't think could be repaired. Not after seeing the folder, not after hearing his own voice on that recording explaining himself to a notary like it was the most normal request in the world. I told her I was proud of her for handling it with a clear head instead of rage, and she said something back that stuck with me for a long time. "You protected me before I even knew I needed protecting." 3 weeks later, Emily filed for an annulment, her lawyer explaining that given how quickly things had unraveled and the clear evidence of what he was after before the marriage even happened, it was a cleaner path than a lengthy divorce process. Tyler didn't fight it much once he realized the recording and Sam's report existed as documented evidence, understanding correctly that dragging this out publicly would only make him look worse. Diane called Emily a handful more times, trying to smooth things over on her son's behalf. But Emily had stopped answering by then, telling me she'd said everything she needed to say already. I finally sat down properly with Emily a few weeks after that. No folders, no recordings, just the 2 of us at my kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I told her the rest of it, the parts I'd skipped over in the rush of that first difficult conversation. I told her about my father, about the years of distance between us, about the guilt I carried for not trying harder to fix things before he died. I told her the $9 million sat there almost like a strange apology from a man who never said sorry out loud while he was alive. I told her I wanted to set some of it aside for her properly, with a lawyer, with paperwork done the right way, not hidden, not rushed, and definitely not connected to anyone who hadn't earned her trust. Honestly, first she cried a little at that, not out of sadness this time, but something closer to relief. And she told me she didn't care about the money nearly as much as she cared about the fact that I'd been quietly protecting her the entire time, even when she had no idea there was anything to protect her from. It's been almost a year now since that morning Tyler walked into my kitchen with a notary trailing behind him like he already owned the place. Emily is doing well, living closer to me now, back in school part-time for something she's wanted to study for years, but never had the space to pursue while she was busy planning a wedding for a man who was really just planning an inheritance. We talk most days, real conversations, not the careful surface-level ones we used to have back when I was hiding something from her without even realizing how much that secret was quietly protecting her. At the same time, I still think about my father sometimes, about the years we lost to stubbornness and pride, and about the strange way his money ended up doing something he probably never intended, exposing a man who would have hurt his granddaughter if I hadn't stayed quiet long enough to see him clearly first. People sometimes ask me if I regret not telling Emily about the inheritance before the wedding, and the honest answer is no, not for one single second. If I had told her, if I had told anyone, Tyler would have had exactly what he wanted from the very beginning, and I never would have seen who he really was until it was far too late to do anything about it. Staying quiet wasn't about hiding money, it was about giving the truth enough room to show itself naturally, without me forcing it, without anyone having a reason to perform kindness they didn't actually feel.